why it's so important for us to present at this stage. As I said, we have still 1 year of project, and 2 of these presentations are part of a PhD thesis, and going PhD thesis. One of them is already done, almost done. But anyway, but these PhDs are also part of the project outcomes. And the other 2 presentations are more, how can I say, post PhD presentations. So as I said yesterday, trying to present the project and trying to present the different kinds of housing that we are trying to track here. We divided the work and the tasks by topics, identify the targets, the kind of neighborhoods and settlements, the kind of different agents involved in the research. We divided among us and among our own interests. And well, I ended with the one who nobody wanted to have, but that's it's how it should be. But on this specific presentation, we will have a case study on middle-class mass housing for mainly for European population in these colonial cities, which is, or as I said, part of the colonial government policies. And that will be presented by Inês Lima Rodrigues. So Inês is an expert on housing, on middle-class mass housing, but also middle-class housing in countries like Brazil and African countries and Macau and in Portugal. So it started like a kind of Lusophone venture, but nowadays we cannot use this word anymore, so we are trying to figure out what the best word to express what Inês did in her PhD a few years ago. So we are always learning. We are trying to improve our concepts and our key concepts and our research questions also. So Inês will bring us here some specific case in colonial Africa related to the middle class and related to housing design and promoted during the colonial war years. We will have then a very specific case of huge companies, how these huge companies operate beside the empire government or beside the colonial government, and how they, in a way, made shadow to the empire itself. So they were stronger and more powerful than the Portuguese government in Africa. So Beatriz Serrazina will present here her PhD research. It's an ongoing research on Diamang company, which was a company dedicated to mining the diamonds in Angola. She will explain you all the details further. And also Francesca, Vita will present us here her research on the Ajuda neighborhood in Guinea-Bissau, which is a very interesting research because it's not only related with the colonial history and narratives, but also related with post-colonial narratives and how to embrace these new narratives. So she has a huge amount of work related to survey, oral history, and she will try to explain us a little more how this Ajuda neighborhood was designed and promoted after a huge fire in Bissau, who mainly affected what was called the native neighborhoods at the time, and and these neighbors tried to, in a way, solve some of these housing problems after the big fire in Bissau in the 60s, and was, of course, made with an effort of war and involving also the military forces, and in a way is related with the military experience in the rural settlements. So for a while we thought that they were using the house typology that they use in the rural settlements in this urban neighborhood, but the research that Francesca did now explained us that it was probably the opposite. So this is quite interesting because, of course, there are these ideas, and all the old narratives were based on oral history mainly, and now with a little more archive work, we were able to, or Francesca were able to establish a new chronology. So as I said, we are trying to figure out how to solve this problem. It was a huge problem, so I will start again by myself. I hope today will be not a problem with my presentation. I did a PDF presentation in order to make it more easier. And so I get the best part, was the part apparently nobody wanted to have, and so it's what I have. I'm here to present something that I have already presented in CES-UC conference, because I have no time to change it, but it's a different title and a different approach, I hope, with more time and without so many pressure as it was at the time. So what I'm going to present is something what is in between the other housing programs that I said before, which are the housing programs related to how to accommodate the African people who reach these urban sites, sites during the war. So as I said it before and yesterday, our project is related to the colonial war, to the liberation war. Started in Angola in 61, and then in Guinea-Bissau in 63, and in 64 was already in Mozambique. So it was 3 fronts of war. Three different fronts of war. So it seems like I have no discipline. So I have for Filipa put me in order. Thank you, Filipa. So it was a period of war, as we said. The war was mainly in the rural areas. It started to be a kind of urban motin, urban rebellion in Luanda in the 4th of February. But then in 61, but then it was controlled by the colonial military forces, and then it became again in March in the north of Angola. So it was mainly a rural war, or guerrilla war, as the military explain us. And so the idea of the project was to explain in the different the different approaches that the colonial government tried to control the war and the damage made by the war, we choose the housing topic as a way to explain how the Portuguese deal with it in terms of architectural occupation, how architecture helped in and supported the war effort. So the first slide, please. Eu posso passar, sorry. Okay, so, sorry. So we have here these different, in a way we have this guerrilla war in the woods, represented by the Portuguese army, and at the same time we have these new income people who come from the rural areas to the cities, and they were not coming only because of the war. They were coming because also in the process industrialization and urbanization were part of the colonial system at the time. So the colonial government were very engaged with this idea of bringing industrialization mainly to Angola and Mozambique, which were the major colonial territories at the time. It was not the same in Guinea-Bissau, for instance, which was still a very agriculture-based economy. But in these main countries, they tried to improve the industrial system, and it seems that they were in a way successes in doing it. So this brought, of course, a lot of new population, new incomes to these cities, and the problem of housing was an old problem in urban space, especially to the so-called native neighborhoods. And of course, in the 60s, it became a huge problem. So not only they could not control anymore this kind of population. So here I will try to explain in a way, or try to track in a way, so as I said, it's an oncoming research. I try to explain in a way how the government and the technicians, and mainly the social science, deal with this, and how the measures that, for instance, social scientists advised the Portuguese government to do, and at the same time, what was the technicians who were in the field were able to do to minimize this main problem. So as I show you this map or this table before, what you are seeing here, it's the different levels of our project, what we would like to address. So I'm here in the first, but in the economic or affordable neighborhoods for the low-income people. And this, of course, as I said, and I presented yesterday, it's the different typologies. It's much larger than this, but if you could identify, so different typologies, so we have these middle-class neighborhoods in the big cities, and not only in the big cities, but also in the medium-sized cities, colonial cities. Then we have these specific neighborhoods to African people, also in urban environment. We have different kind of settlements and colonatos in the mainland, in interior space, for economical reasons, to mining or agriculture sectors. And we have, of course, the famous and more well-known military settlements. And so we have, of course, different target of people. We have the colonial settlers, the European settlers, the European population, also the Africans who were in the process of acculturation, or the Portuguese authorities call it assimilados. And then we have the Portuguese people who come from the rural areas of Portugal to colonize specific directed programs of colonization. We have the African and rural African inhabitants. And we have the villagers who were displaced, the peasants were displaced during the war. And also the agents were different. We saw that marvelous mapping by Peter Scriver today about the agents. So we have the architects who work for private promoters, architects in the municipality. For instance, Francisco Rodrigues, he signed and he designed several neighborhoods for African communities. We have then the technicians who were in the field in the rural areas, like this man here. We don't know who is him, but we know that he was in Estima village in Mozambique, so in the Zambeza plan. So working on the field, designing and building the village with the peasants who were also displaced from their original village. And we have, of course, the military forces. And so I will focus on that side that part of the program. So I tried to make a more how can I say, organized, more framed presentation than I did in IAST after the disaster that it was, trying to identify some of the topics that I would like to present to you and debate to you, with you, of course, and I look forward to the comments and the advices. So I started this idea from indigenous housing to accommodation of the weak, economically weak. So it's also a change of terminology. So the reports, in the beginning, they talk about indigenous people, indigenous native people, and so on. And then, in the end, during the war, they don't address the African communities like this anymore. They address them as economically weak persons, so people with low income, and how to accommodate this kind of population. And then the technical solution, how the architects and the engineers saw the problem or tried to solve the problem, and how the politicians in Lisbon saw the problem, which is different parts of how to approach it also, and some final considerations which are not well framed yet. So, starting with the first idea. So. The problem, so we have this kind of a city that started to be also a military, to be a scenario for military apparatus. So you can see here in '61, after the war, this military army went to the street, to demonstrate their power, and they used the colonial city, the modern city, to express as a stage to express their power. And as I said, the war was not being here. It was not in the cities, but of course it was necessary to demonstrate power where the most European settlers were. And at the same time, we have this drawing by Mário de Oliveira, one of the architects who was involved in the colonial office. It's an exploratory design plan for Quilimbambi in Mozambique, and he specifies the white part and the black part. So the white neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods, and he put it in a graphic way. And we used this map for several years, and maybe because we were not focused enough, we never realized that he was expressing something. He was saying, that here it's a formal city, we know exactly what happens here, and there is something that we don't know exactly what it is. We only know the main roads, the main streets, the main avenues who connected the formal city with the rest of the country. And we started to realize that maybe Mário de Oliveira was a very, very traditional and conventional architect, very right-wing architect. He was a defensor of the colonial authority, but maybe he was telling us something when he was drawing this. But anyway, so the housing issue started to be for the Portuguese government, started to be a problem related with European settlers. So the African communities were not addressed in that picture, because in terms of how the political government saw it, they were able to build their own houses. So they didn't need the help of the government to do it. So they could do it without help. But on the other side, and this is part of the research that Filipa is developing. Filipa, unfortunately, she will not be here with us today. Well, she is here, but not with our table. So the main issue was, of course, to see how to address housing for the Europeans, because, and as is written there, it was this idea that one of the indispensable conditions for the colonization of Angola is, this is quoting a document at the time, the construction of proper housing for Europeans. So in the beginning, of course, was the idea how to accommodate the European and how to accommodate them in a very modern way. And then, of course, there are lots of literature and the state of the art talking about this idea of the segregation city and how these neighborhoods, these native neighborhoods, were not visible in the maps, in the drawings, and we know well that sometimes they were uncovered in a way, but it started to change in the 60s, and there was really a motivation to try to understand how was the layout of these neighborhoods, of these self-built neighborhoods, and this in this map in Porto Amélia, in Mozambique, you can see the formal city, and then the African neighborhood, and also the architect started to photograph and to record and to try to even to draw the urban housing in this kind of settlements, of neighborhoods. And so they identified two problems. For the first one, of course, was that there was for a long time, a long period, there was no investment in trying to understand the indigenous house and how to design it. And the other problem, of course, was this segregation, who make these two cities apart. And the first experience were done with a very, we could say, pragmatical ways, like this kind of houses. This was, it was in one of the first experience in Luanda in 42, 43, and he was so celebrated that it was there was news on the papers about how many houses they were able to build, for instance, and not only the houses, but how many compartments. So they measured the colonial achievements in terms of compartments to say we are doing really trying to change these neighborhoods by improving the housing conditions. And of course, this was a very pragmatic design. And so, of course, there was the technicians were trying to frame the different goals of these new neighborhoods. So the first goal, of course, was this idea that this housing will be able to civilize the African population. So we can see in these photographs, if you do a zoom, like Johan Lage said yesterday that we should do to these pictures, you can see, for instance, the different activities of this African population, where in terms of a Western standard will be will be more acceptable. And the second question was they needed to free some areas in the cities in order to accommodate the Europeans. That part of the cities were already occupied with Musex. And of course, the third was that they could share and could build proper and specific equipments for this population. So you can see here in Mário de Oliveira urban plan for Bissau, or you can see here in how to accomplish that. And so then the social scientists started also to be part of the issue. And of course, the problem was that in the beginning, this was a sanitary problem, how to accommodate these people who were not living in proper conditions, but started to be a political problem. It's when it's a political problem that the social scientists came. And of course, they started to alert the European government or the colonial government that there were a lot of people coming from the countryside, and that could fright the peaceful environment that the Europeans lived in cities. And for these social scientists also, the city was a way for this assimilation process. And housing, of course, it's one of the major tools in this process. So you can see the African people in using the urban space in ways that they probably wouldn't use before, using the service, the public service here in Lubito, for instance, and of course being the propaganda by the colonial regime saying, you know, that the African people lived in the same way as others because they were not anymore segregated on the cities. Also the social sciences try to explain how the cities should grow, where these people should be located if they are different social conditions. So this started to be a political and economical way. And as Amadeu Castilho Soares said, only a few could benefit from a central urban location, so the people who were already in the process of assimilation. And so these were this kind of lodgements, like Fundação Salazar lodgements with 4 blocks, made by the Junta de Construções de Bairros Populares in Mozambique, and even the layout, the idea of having a kind of a square, an internal square, you know, to improve this idea of urbanity and the layout of the apartment, was exactly the same or very similar to the layout of the European population with the same economical condition. So these are some aspects of the houses. And so we have different possibilities, like the social scientist said. We have urban neighborhoods, and we could and then for the others who are in the process of being urbanized, we should put them in a more peripheral area, in the outskirts of the city, in one-stored houses, so not blocks, but houses, smaller houses, detached houses, because it was a process. And so they built these houses. The process is very interesting because most of these houses were designed by the public works, but were built by private promoters. For instance, in São Paulo, the Bairro Popular de São Paulo in Luanda, they built 640 semi-detached houses, very elementary. And this idea that the colonial technicians defended, there was this idea that the family, the Africans, the families desired more and more an Occidental house, an Occidental frame, an Occidental aesthetics also, and so that was what they were trying to give them. In this, they learn in conference like the conference of Nairobi, where the Portuguese technicians went and present some of the works. So these large neighborhoods were built outside and sometimes could have this dimension. In Lubito, Francisco Rodrigues built 2,700 units, and you know was the idea to target this kind of populations. So, how to address the technical solution? So, the idea, of course, was these large neighborhoods, these mosaics in the cities, were danger places. So they should be, in a way, we should act over them, so should intervention there, and should be replaced by mixed communities. And here, because the political discourse changed, these mixed communities were defined by economical condition and not anymore by racial segregation. So this was what the document said. It's not saying that it was implemented in the field. And also, one of the problems was how to address this amount of people. So they introduced different kinds of solutions. Self-construction was one of them. Everybody knows the very well sophisticated projects of Simões de Carvalho in terms how to use the technology, the vernacular technology used by the fishermen in the Luanda Islands to the new houses, a more pragmatic approach by Castro Rodrigues. And then, of course, this leads for a huge problem, how much does it cost? And so when it arrives Lisbon with the numbers, how it would cost, the Portuguese government said, no, it's impossible to do it. So we have to approach it in a different way. And the housing problem during the war was addressed in terms of colonial territories was addressed only twice. And the first and most important debate was in '66. And of course, the main problems were in terms of demographic data, so how to put all these different populations living together. So the Europeans were in some cities, like for instance in Sá da Bandeira, which is Lubango nowadays in Angola, the European population were more than the African population. That was not the case in most of the places, but how to put all these people live together in a way, and how to address modest solutions. So the political solution was very clear. Only those who could afford to buy or rent masonry houses would occupy them. So self-construction was increased. And of course, the idea of the palhota persisted in the urbanized landscape. So that idea that that the African house should be westernized in a way just disappear from the political and technical plans. And even in plans like, for instance, in Mozambique, the plans from the Junta de Bairros Casas Populares in the Beira context, they introduced this idea of how to control the self-construction houses. And of course, these were related with this kind of populations who worked in the industrial area of the city. So they introduced this kind of units, new units, with this design, very humble design of the houses. I usually like to address my students if it is a house designed by an architect, and of course it is, because we have the corner window, we have the central window, we have the pillar, which is asymmetric, and all the design, the details of the windows. So we know that was the architects were, of course, involved, but the units built were it was very modest in terms of numbers. And of course, we visit some of these houses, and was, of course, very elementary, the plan. Another problem was the condition of women, and also this was a very important political issue, also because the house used a way to also civilize the African women, and the role of women was very important in terms of family education also. And because most of the domestic servants were, in a way, men, this European discourse was a little more far away from women, so house was really important. And one of the second African deputy elected for National Assembly in Lisbon was one of the persons who explained to the other deputies how these programs were important for emancipating the African women. So these were the policies there were on the field, and that were under the table. So in the end, they realized, and in 4 weeks, I think, before the April Revolution, they debated. The National Assembly debated again the problem of these populations and the problem of housing the African population in the colonial territories, and they concluded that all the programs were a failure because, as I'm going to read it, the economic segregation ended up being racial. So this idea that we could separate people, or you could identify these people by economical conditions, didn't work, and it considered contrary to the idea of the Portuguese wanted to promote multiracial policies. And so it was impossible, this is what the deputies concluded in Lisbon, it was impossible to accomplish the intensive day-to-day social contact with individuals from other social cultural strata. So they concluded that these programs, in order to mix the different populations, it just highlighted more and more the segregation conditions. And so what they proposed that we should start it from the beginning. So these people should be maintained in rural areas. They should be they should not incentivize them to go to the cities, to the urban sites, and they should improve the rural conditions, so they would provide these people to go to the cities by fixing this kind of office, more mobile office that are on the field, designing and also we see that the agents also changed. So the architect in the municipality changed to this kind of technician, who is a very pragmatic one, could be an architect, an engineer, but also could be other kind of a technician from the public works. And of course, they return in a kind of a poetic, I don't know if it is a poetic or not, they return to deal again with this idea of trying to interpret what could be a traditional vernacular design, or what could be more close to the populations they wanted to maintain in the countryside. And so you see the model here, and here you see some of these buildings built with some of these houses built with the project that they developed on the field. So thank you very much, and now I will ask Francesca to come, and she will have the same subject.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I will try to rush a little bit, not too much, but I will do my best. So today I'm going to talk about domestic space, problematizing it together with colonialism and modernity. I start from the assumption made by Anthony King and stating that a distinctive form of housing, the bungalow, was an important element in the vast process of urbanization, which, during the course of the 20th century, was instrumental in transforming the economic, social, cultural, and political life of Africa. King also suggested that house can be considered as a tool of the empire in the way Hedrick addressed the steamboat, the quinine, the raffle, and the communication infrastructures. So I'm going to use the house as a critical tool in order to discuss the inscription of colonialism and modernity in nowadays environment and practices, and at the same time to reflect how inhabitants are relating to it and how this can inform our research on colonial architecture. To do so, I selected the case study of Ajuda neighborhood, one of the few neighborhoods promoted by the colonial state and built in Bissau under the colonial rule. The neighborhood was built in 1965, already during the colonial war, and it was meant to dwell mostly African public servants. Even if there is this narrative about this fire that Anna Milheiro was referring to. It was located about 6 kilometers from the consolidated city at the margin of the unplanned neighborhood that were mostly inhabited by the autochthonous population. Ajuda neighborhood was located in a very isolated area, resulting in an experience of self-sufficient residential units served with school, cultural center, marketplace, port facilities, etc. Just for you to know, nowadays, the neighborhood stands in a very central area of Bissau's economic and cultural life. At the beginning of the 60s, and I will rush a little. At the beginning of the 60s, in Bissau, the Public Works Department and the municipality, as Anna was saying, not only in Guinea, but in Angola and Mozambique also, were struggling implementing the urbanization plan, and in Bissau, the one meant for the city designed by the architect Mário de Oliveira. They were also, and especially, disagreeing on the topic of housing for the African population. While the plan suggested the relocation of a vast number of people in 3 new neighborhoods built from scratch and adopting elementary house types, in the context of Bissau, the municipality refused to force the local population to build types of houses that they could not afford, accepting that in the plot, each person was free to build as their own custom a simple and rudimentary hut, according to their possibilities and free will. Just to give you a sense of how these operations weren't consensual and pacific. The aim of the construction of Ajuda neighborhood was at the end to please both parties. The neighborhood was in fact meant as a tentative to set a role model neighborhood that would inspire the suburban population how to dwell and behave. In fact, the way of living in suburban areas, which were based on vernacular and rural practices in Bissau, were addressed by the colonial apparatus as promiscuous, insalubrious, anti-hygienic, etc. So I'm using some drawing from a primary school manual to illustrate the ideal domestic practices that were wished by the colonial administration. Contacting with the residents nowadays, they referred that homes had to be tidy, gardens clean and well kept, beds properly done. Meals had to be consumed with cutlery on the table and properly sit on chair. The administration of the neighborhood organized competition between families to keep the standard as wished and promoted in the family a sense of proudness. Family in return won items for the house, such as bed sheets and other items. The non-fulfillment of the neighborhood rules meant expulsion from it. So I will pass some images of the plan of the neighborhood, which quite basic and resemble, in our opinion, anticipated the experience of the resettled village that would have been built in the following years by the Portuguese army in the rural areas. So this is, this is the plan, and here you can see how people organize in the rural areas themselves in a vernacular way. And these were also reflected not only in the vernacular environment, but also in Bissau, and not only at that time, but also very recently, and even nowadays. And the pictures above is from the 80s, but nowadays we can still find this way of organizing and in communities and where domestic spaces really live outside and in a very organic way. So if the urban plan is quite elementary, the house type implemented is also very simple. It is the classical 3-bedroom and a living room house types. The kitchen is an enclosed space and attached to the backside veranda, while the toilet facilities were designed to be an attached exterior space. And as for the neighborhood plan, the house type also might have anticipated the ones built in the resettled villages. And these are 2 images of Ajuda house type on the left and the former resettled village house type on the right. So resuming, Ajuda neighborhood embodies some of the Portuguese colonial modus operandi concerning the issues of urban housing for the African population. So house was an agency of Western modernity, suggesting to the Guinean population what were considered higher standards of living. House was also adopted as a tool to discriminate certain categories of individuals, according, for example, to the construction technologies and the room specialization. House was instrumentalized to promote access to a certain status and privilege, and a type of house also meant to settle in the urban environment a type of family and labor force according to the modern model of bourgeoisie family. So what I'm asking is how colonialism and modernity are inscribed in the contemporary environment and spatial practices in Bissau, and how people are reacting to this legacy. So after the independence in 1974, emancipatory processes started and a traditional domesticities began to re-emerge from the colonial speciality. Families started to rejoin, to grow again, and to reorganize themselves according to Guinean traditional kinship. However, for example, in Ajuda, the maintenance of the original facade denotes a certain will to conform to the collective image of the neighborhood impressed during the colonial time, which is even nowadays perceived as role model, exceptional, stating and reinforcing an holistic social status. So if the main facade is kept as the original one, the Guinean domesticities is revealed in the back side of the house, which has been transformed or by the occupation and enclosure and expansion of the backside veranda, resulting in a space usually used for an informal dining room, or by the additions of new construction in the lot area. So this reconfiguration of the lot, of the plot maybe, in the backside of the house recreates, in my opinion, the resilience of the domestic environment that can be found in rural settlements that are organized, these are some images of this backside of the houses in Ajuda, and these are the rural usage of this outdoor space. The rural settlements that are organized in small clusters called morança, which is a term that comes from the word inhabit in Portuguese. So a morança, which is the scheme on one of them on the left, is where the enlarged Guinean family lives, and it is characterized by numerous houses whose voids are filled with collective function and communal spaces. Because the Guinean way of life, of living inhabited in the domestic space, is extended, especially on the outside of the wall of the house. So one of the activities that occurs in this outer or semi-outer space in the rural area is the meals preparation, and the very same happens in Ajuda, or to some extent. So as it happens in this rural way of living, or vernacular way of living, the space of the kitchen also in Ajuda is fragmented into multiple places according to the elementary functions of preserve, wash, cut, cook the raw materials. Kitchen is where the water is to clean dishes or vegetable, is the space to storage cooking tools. It is where the cooking areas are, which can be interior with gas stoves or exterior with charcoal grills. Is where the refrigerator, the microwave, or the gas stoves equipment also are. I can't go more into details, just to show this is the same house, and you can see how many spaces the kitchens can occupy. So if the kitchen usage is an example of how colonial legacy can be reinscribed, nowadays the dining room reveals the tension between the will to conform to a modern and colonial speciality and practices, the colonial specialities and practices, and social status, and the introduction of a new compartment, which is neither, let's say, a legacy from colonial time, neither a legacy from the vernacular way of living. So in the cases such as the one portrait in this slide, where the back veranda was ampliated and occupied, the dining room is usually doubled into two well-defined rooms, the formal dining room and the small dining room. So the informal dining room is linked, which is the one on the left, the one on the right, sorry. It's usually, is usually linked to the garden in the backyard of the house and to the kitchen. It is a space used both for dining, for staying, for kids doing their homework, etc. While the formal dining room, which is the one on the left, is located in the original division of the colonial plan, and it formally suggests that there is a family who gathers during the main meals of the day and who consumes its meal according to rituals and items based on European practices. However, Guinean families in Ajuda also are polynuclear families. They do not have the Portuguese habit to gather all the members during the daily meals. The routine of the different members of the family is not synchronized, and everyone from adult to children follows his or her own routine, rarely meeting up for mealtime. So at this point, you have an idea of which was the original plan and the original idea and ideal of a modern way of living, even if we need to expand our definition of modern, and how people appropriate and how people react to these house-type, colonial, modern, salubrious, etc. So I will try to, in my thesis, I'm trying to understand what happened in the between and how all of this can inform our research on colonial architecture. Sorry. So when I asked Ajuda's inhabitants why they were pleased to live in the neighborhood, they answered me. For example, the way to behave in Ajuda, it's different from the other neighborhood. If I see someone walking down the street, I can recognize if he or she is from Ajuda neighborhood. When we were kids, we were always surveilled from neighbors' parents. Formality, which do not have much importance in others' neighborhoods, as in Ajuda do. People who live in Ajuda are well-behaved people. Well, the question that I asked was why they like to live in the neighborhood, and the answer was because it was a urbanized area. But because of the answer that I showed you, I realized that this urbanized idea went well beyond just the plan. It was related to a way of, as they said, to behave, to behave, to a language that they are replicating, maybe, or assuming, inherited from the colonial past. In Bissau, for example, there's a way to define people, inhabitants from this neighborhood. They call them panyape, which means people who know how to behave. So I was intrigued by the use of urbanized word, and I went to the Portuguese vocabulary. Because in Italy, for example, urbanized, it's a very specific word, and we don't use a lot in the current language. So according to the Portuguese vocabulary, urbanizing means to become urban, of course, but also to civilize. And in a figurative sense, it has the connotation of to become polite and polished. So the word of polite, polished, civilized, urbanized resonate in me the very essence of the Portuguese colonialism. So if the bungalow was in fact shaped African social, cultural, spatial dimensions, my question is, which idea of modernity that space was conveying, how it is inscribed in nowadays environment and practices, and how people relate to it. But I think that in order to understand the first part of the question, so which modernity, that space, the colonial space, and especially the dwelling space during colonial times, and specifically maybe the bungalow typology, I think we really, to understand this, I think we really need to decolonize the way we think the house and its fundamental elements. So thank you very much.
Okay, so hello, good morning. First of all, I must thank you for your presence here, for your time, for your attention, and also say that it's a great honor to be here presenting with my colleagues and researchers, friends who I admire so much. Okay, so as part of our team's research topics, and particularly as part of my PhD project, I've been studying over the last couple of years the spaces resulting from the mining activities of DINÄMIA'CET, a private mining company that operated in the Lunda district, so in the northeastern border of Angola, roughly from the mid-1910s until the late 80s, so most of the time, but not all of the time, under the Portuguese rule, and this is an important information, as we shall see in a minute. So as the major player in that borderland region, DINÄMIA'CET built over the years more than 20 so-called urban centers, settlements for Europeans, and hundreds of small villages throughout Lunda for the more than almost 20,000 workers that work in the mines. And this was produced always in close contact with other mining enterprises in Belgium, Congo, and in South Africa. And most of these enterprises operated within fairly bounded areas, and their remote location was translated into the need and as well as the will to experiment with new planning ideas. And this is more or less what I'm trying to explore in my PhD. So from the earlier decades, companies explored this relationship between power and space, over space, through space. And in this regard, the built environment was always perceived as a major asset and as a key tool to pursue their economic activities. So DINÄMIA'CET was considered a state within a state, the ninth colony of the empire, and while I believe it's my job to unpack these sentences that don't say much about what happened on the ground, actually. I think they are useful here for us to understand really how powerful the company show itself within the Portuguese colonial scene. So focusing on Ashwar's scope, today I will share with you a few remarks about the special entanglements between DINÄMIA'CET and the war effort in the late colonial period in Angola. And while this particular topic is not on the core of my project, I think it offers indeed key perspectives that I'm still trying to manage and to dialogue with, and that's what I'm sharing with you today. So I will use these, go through these three different frameworks: entanglement, detachment, and resilience, to reflect on the process of the alleged spatial and social so-called modernization put forward by DINÄMIA'CET in the late colonial period, so roughly from the mid-1950s until the mid-70s, considering the significance of the grammars of stabilization that were at the roots of the so-called developmentalist discourses, as well as the hesitations and the obstacles that were involved in the execution of the company's various plans and buildings to counter the warfare context. So moving into this first section, this is a map of the war that was happening, the conflicts that were happening in Angola in 1970s. And as you can see, Lunda was mostly devoid of conflict. And I would say that most of this happened because of the presence of the company and how he had organized that part of the territory. So the colonial war was considered active in London from 1966 onwards. And António Soares Carneiro was, as a direct consequence, was nominated Lunda's governor. He was a military with a great warfare experience by then. And from the moment he stepped into the district administration, Carneiro put his main efforts in building what he called an expedite development plan to transform Lunda's landscape. And this is some of the results of this plan. It encompassed multiple typologies on different scales, from roads to school, water supply, and sanitation. And the photograph here is Carneiro. The photographs were clear. he was determined to win the hearts and minds of the local population, as advised by the Counterinsurgency Council of Angola. And one of the main sponsors of Carneiro's scheme was the DINAMIAC, in fact. So, of course, the mining company was also very interested in keeping that area in peace. But, and as plenty of notes would tell, this war had many agendas, and sometimes they were contrasting and overlapping. So, Carneiro would say that in the district of Lunda, civilians and militaries are building major work. So we had this entanglement between the civil population and the military effort that I explored in the previous Congress 4 years ago. Today I would like to dive further into this detachment that happened with the DINAMIAC, because a district as vast as Lunda cannot live on a single economic sector. So at the same time that the Portuguese government was fighting the colonial war, he was also fighting the DINAMIAC in some way in order to keep peace. So the relationship, and moving on now to the second part, the relationship between the colonial state and the DINAMIAC was always troubled. This was nothing new. So from the inception of the company, there were always problems about the administration of the territory. And when the war began in the early 60s, the company was considered a thorn in the side of the administration, of course, because of these clashing visions on how to organize space mostly. For the DINAMIAC, however, these were great news at some point, because since the early 40s, the company had been worried about the particular threats, and it was the Portuguese state, what the company called the Portuguese state psychosocial fury. Because of the many international meetings that had shed light on the relationship between urbanization and modernization, namely those organized under the CCTA, or the Rhodesian Livingstone Institute. So companies, not only the DINAMIAC, but most of the companies, the private companies operating in Central Africa, they were already really aware that they had to change something in order to survive. And in fact, due to on the ground, what happened is that when Lunda was reorganized, this was part of the Portuguese state strategy to reorganize the territory and regroup villages, and we have already seen some images yesterday at Tiago's and Rui's session of these regroupments and these what they called the reordenamentos. When Lunda was reorganized, most of these villages were in DINAMIAC's area. This was a private area, considered by the state a private area. And so some of what happened is that the colonial war put this major, I would say, I'm missing the word here, but DINAMIAC was really involved. He had to be really involved in this warfare effort as well, even if the company was not really interested in taking part of the war. So here we see the villages that were built by then, and the company would say that because of these earlier meetings in the 50s, it had already built a lot of great places for people, so there was no need to change anything. That was the argument. So, and because of this social spatial knowledge that the company had gathered over time, it would promote, at the same time that the military were taking part of the company's facilities, bringing new technologies, for instance, to speedily building new military facilities and houses at the same time. So the company was building these neighborhoods, these recreative centers, and also shops and hospitals. So while it said that nothing had to change, some things begin to change. And so the DINÄMIA'CET started producing these maps of the mining area, where the company would point out all of these facilities, and these maps were given to the Portuguese government, and they circulated among the military, and the archive shows that. And the company had this bigger scale, the territorial scale, and then would zoom in until the neighborhoods. These are just some images to show you the kind of programs the company was working with. Okay, this part, resilience, third part. Why is this important? This is a question that I've been debating a bit about my PhD thesis. And I would start with this notion of coloniality. We have already spoken. Alessandro gave us his fantastic lecture about this. So we have this idea of coloniality that exists as a form of deep inscription in landscapes, ideas and practices. And it follows the idea of afterlife, of reverberations that continue to structure everyday life. So these forms of coloniality are often very hidden from us. We see them, but we don't recognize them as such. So this is just what the literature has been thinking about this notion. And what got me thinking about this were a very recent newspaper article and TV report covering Lunda, both of the summer of 2020. In particular, they addressed Dundu, DINÄMIA'CET headquarters, that today stand as the main town in the region. And identity, culture, tourism, collective memory, development are some of the topics mentioned in this very short article, but I think it's very illuminating. Because all of them are very in line with the very familiar, canonical, authorized heritage narratives. Surprising, though, is that not a single mention is made here of the colonial circumstances that produced these spaces and buildings, even if the first line states that Lunda seeks to move towards the future without forgetting its undoubtedly valuable past. And the past is there, but is completely neutralized, I would say, because amongst all narratives of exceptionality of this space, the space of the company towns, the oases, the paradises. So the Portuguese state had always, and the company itself, they were always really interested in putting forward this image of a really oasic working man paradise. And this narrative is still there. In this article, and the houses are appreciated for their, I'm quoting, peculiar architectural style, their outdoor green spaces, and their unique pleasant look. So this is written in the article. And at the same time, the colonial genesis is transformed, and the company is presented as a multinational enterprise. So DINÄMIA'CET nowadays is considered this multinational enterprise, and that was true. But not a single reference is made to the Portuguese, but rather to the Belgian and the Americans who participated as well in the company activities. So I would say making colonialism a bit easier to ignore here. If we really step back and we read the text in the light of the past, as suggested by the article itself, this stands as a very partial picture that completely ignores the violence that underpinned DINÄMIA'CET spaces. And this is now from the television report that goes along the same lines. Dundu is described as a unique and exclusive city, and the interviewees, always men, refer to the historical value and to the heritage that should stay as it is. They are afraid of losing the matrix, and they look at the old days with nostalgia, while criticizing those who have no knowledge of the past. Yet, paradoxically, the company is mentioned as the builder. So, because the company is the ones who made these houses, reinforcing this already mentioned distorted strategy. And in fact, I would argue that both paper and TV news show that while architecture and DIAMAG's architecture and urban planning stem from colonial aesthetics and policies, no reflection is yet made about them, allowing the persistence of many of these spatial strategies. This idea seems to be so ingrained in the residents' use of space that those who don't follow these old dynamics are understood are unauthorized developments. So how architecture as a discipline, a practice, and a discourse operates this as a mechanism where colonial violence was and still is, I would say, produced, completely remains a blind spot here. Now, to deal with these legacies and to think about the nature and forms of coloniality, we have already some fantastic literature being produced. And some of these authors advocate for broader archaeological methods, recalling with some ideas that I find really worth it. So a critical tracking of genealogies, an uncovering of hidden archives, and a tracing of hidden sources of practices and ideas. And I think agents like DIAMAG, which are still to be explored, can offer new perspectives and helping us to address some of these questions. So here we have some pictures that were taken last year, and I would go just quickly to these slides to further reinforce that. I think it's to a critical understand of the past that we realize that this process of distortion was precisely at the core of the so-called stabilization policies pursued by colonial companies, in which housing was a key question. So both Anna and Francesca and Inês, I'm sure she would say that housing was really the core program here. And so also these corporations operated under these clouds of knowledge, these supra, they will call at some point, these supra-imperial clouds of knowledge that constrained the production of space in these imperial zones. So this is something that was happening since the 20s, in this idea of stabilization under this umbrella. Coming full circle here to this idea of resilience, it in fact, I think, it stressed how impossible it is to speak about these spaces without acknowledging their genealogy. And however, that's not the case for the research that has been recently made about these towns as boom towns with very precarious environments. And I believe that we can justify this absence by the inability of architectural history to disclose these landscapes as crucial pieces and scaffolds in empire building, making it hard to question them in their long term. So we lose here between this division of colonial, post-colonial, we lose these continuities. For this reason, and as already stated by many of us here at the Congress, I really stand by the need to focus on these buildings not as inert remains, but as persistent imperial formations that occupy multiple historical tenses, that are unfinished histories running in past continuous, like Anna Laura Stoller has argued. So just to conclude here with this slide, and a few last remarks, I would say that company spaces like those created by DIAMAG confronted us with the need and to broaden our understanding of architectural production beyond the colonial nationalist frameworks, while directing greater attention to transnational connections. So we can see here some of the models that were that could be found in Lunda because of the war effort, because they needed to really speedy build new houses. So the balloon houses that Professor Johan talked yesterday, they were built in Lunda. Trajinha houses from the Cabora Bassa Dam were brought to Lunda. Orensteinblad from South Africa were also brought to Lunda. And then some of these models circulated throughout Angola afterwards. So we are really talking here about a big network of model transfers. And significant networks, not only these ones, but I would say many more, put these company towns at the crossroads of empires, like Miles Larmer has noticed when studying the Copper Belt. And therefore, they defy geographic binaries, and to understand them, we really need to be sensitive to how ideas and concepts were translated as well as circulated. They show us that architecture produced under colonialism was not always tied to the creation of a nationalist tactic controlled by state actors or agencies linked to the colonial state itself.
Everyone, so first of all, I want to thank you so much for being here today. So I think I can call you the resilience research. Thank you, Beatriz. The resilience researchers that are still here in the third day with a smile in the face. So thank you so much. So following the previous presentations of my colleagues that like Beatriz, I also have so proud to meet and collaborate with them for a long time. So I try to go following the proposal, go straight to the point. And the purpose of this presentation is in somehow situate when industrialization takes the command and understand the role of the construction companies in the housing impetus during the Portuguese Colonial War in Luanda. So that was mainly for the middle class, as Anna had trying, but not only as we are going to see. So I think my interest, or better, my need to understand the role of the construction companies on housing in Luanda in this case emerged after seeing the huge amount of modern housing that is still in Luanda. So the environment of Luanda is characterized by the modern movement. So it's not thought it's an architecture of author or anonymous, but proliferate all over the city, in the center cities and for the sky outskirts of the city. So as we'll see. And this need emerge for that. So the research is still in the beginning, but I have to say that I'm much more confident after see the presence of Professor Johan Lage and about the expectation of open a new argument on construction history and who knows, open a new lines of research. So since the beginning, some questions have arisen, such as how our housing structures is defined in Angola during this last period of colonialism, Portuguese colonialism, that was overlapping with the colonial war that we are going to see, or did the private promoters act as mediators between the private contents and the state administrations, and how they influenced in these construction techniques or details of the architectural design. And of course, if they were involved also, not only for projects for the middle class that we are talking about, mainly for a European middle class, or instead of that, if they look also for the local population. So the questions arose very fast, but not so easy the answers, because there's still a big void about the work of the large constructions companies. And I think it's not only in the Portuguese context, but also in the global context, because as you can understand, the actors who, by definitions, strive for economies of scale and avoid expensive costs, so are almost the opposite that we are when we're starting to have architectural project. So before going into detail of the specifics of the issue, I want to very, very short time framework of the developments. So, of course, I will not talk about, because I think everybody knows the importance of the first CM, the Congress for the Modern Architecture Modern, and the mark of the end of the Second World. And I want to highlight also, it was the same year that was established the United Nations. So in 1960, the United Nations approved the Declaration of the Granting Independence to Colonial Countries and People. So the Anti-Colonialist Declaration was approved in 1960. The declaration affirmed the right of the people to self-determination and proclaiming an early and unconditioned end to the colonialism. 2 years later, a special commission on decolonizing was established to monitor his implementation. So the terminus of decolonization was launched in 1962, and we are still today discussing this topic. So it's a big void between this framework. So at the same time, very, very short, we can overlap the Portuguese timeline that you can see in 1933. So at the same time that the European modern architects were traveling in a boat to Athens in the 4th CM to launch the Athens Charter. It was the same year that was approved the Portuguese political constitution and led by Oliveira Salazar. So since from that moment, the presence of Portuguese colonialism in Africa was initiated. So, and we are realize, paradoxically, a proof of the inconsistencies, I don't know if this word exists, of history, so when they don't fit in the same way. So, and we can see how it's possible in 1960. 1960 was approved the anti-colonial declaration, and Portugal not only did not end its colonial empire in Africa, but start a colonial war in 1961. So just 1 year after this situation. So as you already listened, the Portuguese colonialism was one of the most latest to end, and besides that, Salazar can keep going this colonial empire besides the critics from United Nations. So, and for instance, just in a brief way to understand that in 1961 the constitution was amended, and they changed it just a few terms, like as empires or colonies were replaced by overseas and provinces. It's true that it's more important was the establishment of the state of the assimilados there, but although, as I said before, in 1961 the colonial war began. So, and you know that it was going until 1974 with the revolution of Portugal that opened the way to the liberation of African colonies. So it's visible in this iconic poster by Henrique Galvão in the first Portuguese colonial exhibition in Porto in 1934, that the area of Portugal and the Portuguese colonial empire was compared with the main European countries. So Galvão tried to demonstrate that Portugal wasn't a small country, or Angola was many Portugals, 10 in this picture to be more precise. So at the same time, the economic pressure in the metropolis led the Portuguese construction companies to seek new markets outside the metropolis. And the African territories, of course, had enormous attraction. So these construction companies became the responsible for ensuring the modern housing boom in Angola, and its activity was strongly supported by Oliveira Salazar. But the case of Luanda stands out with the architecture that he calls Fernão Simões de Carvalho, who after specialized in urbanism in the prestigious Institute of Urbanism in Paris, instead of go back to Angola and became head of Luanda planning offices in the city council of Luanda city. So he proposed the master plan of Luanda in the beginnings of the 60s, and with mainly assent in 4 circular roads establish a good relationship between the main road systems and the city keys element, the neighborhood unit, announcing Carvalho's futuristic vision about Luanda do Futuro. Luanda do Futuro, or Future of Luanda, in which Simões tried to explore the qualities of the Luanda Master Plan, describing the waste as a consequence of the penury and the superfluous of the city. So in doing so, he drew on the quotations from the Le Corbusier and Robert Ausel, with whom he had worked collaborate in Paris during 4 years. So, by the overlap the plan with the satellite photographies now allow us to better just to understand the territory and the location of these neighborhoods. So the neighborhoods go to the periphery and instead to establish in the center situation. So they start to go with the proposal for the middle class to live in the peripheries, has an urban strategy to go on. At the same time, the repetition, as I said in the beginning, of the isolated buildings they had consolidate the urban landscape and environment of Luanda city center. So a new urban facade from the marginal avenue with up to the city allows us to understand how powerful is the modern architecture in Luanda. So for instance, a brief example, everybody of course knows who the unity of Marseille de Le Corbusier. Maybe everybody doesn't know that Pereira da Costa built almost in the same years a similar building adapted to the conditions of one of the main streets of Luanda. So it's that kind of situations that we can realize that happen. So the large Portuguese firms became political actors by building abroad, shaping the built environment in different geographies and political contexts, attracting the participation of the multidisciplinary professionals by combining design, construction, materials, components, marketing and advertising, allowing comment in the real estate market whole and a definitive influence on supply. So, in my opinion, one key factor was the creation of the horizontal property regime in Portugal, that it was applied with minor changes in Angola. So I don't know if this term exists in English, I don't think so. So the horizontal property regime provides the segregation of buildings in groups and allow to the investments sell the apartments by each unit. So, among the large Portuguese construction companies that operate in Angola, it's very interesting to see the evolution of housing throughout the advertisings of the company of Confinca. So from the late 60s, 50s, to be more precise, in 1958, hours since the first advertisement carried out by Confinca, there was a boom in the scale of the buildings of housing. But if you realize, they have only the happy couple looking for the new housing that can be the dream of having a home by their own. So this expiration was visible through housing advertisements, as for example, when the Lar de Namib cooperative advertised the most beautiful functional housing building in Angola. A dream come true. So the housing was dissemination like a dream, possible to everybody. So the book Building, as it know, the building in Guilherme Capelo Street, if I'm not mistaken, and the architecture is Pinto dos Reis, yes, exactly. So if you fix the date, it was in 1974, a little bit before the revolution. So this paradox of these different dreams of different people. So the growing population in Luanda during the 50s and onwards was evaluated by the lack of efficient responses to housing storage for the most social classes. And for that we can see that faithful to the Agnes Gartner doctrine, Fernão Simões Carvalho planning the city design with the structural elements, avoiding the excessive zoning well located in the center of the city. So if you see, we can have the yellow unit, the Central Civic. After we have the blue ones are the residential units. Two, these more red ones are the rehousing units, and one industrial unit on the north of the city. So Simões Carvalho suggested exchanging the municipal land in a center to the new residential areas in the suburbs by attributing construction to the private companies, stretching the importance of applying the modern theory in this block. So the strategy came arise in the urban hem to encourage the private developers to change the building that can say. So you can see here the announced advertising of the Buriti Musek. Musek is a slum, the terminology in Angola. So they will emerge for 5,000 people. So it's a large scale that was applied to housing. So you can see the detail of the design and all the imports that were given to the collective space and the circulation schemes. So this is another example of the urbanization of Prenda neighborhood. So the Prenda was a very huge mosaic, and for instance, the four first unit neighborhoods belongs to this mosaic. Unfortunately, just one, the number one, was going forward. With very precise urban modern principles were applied, as you can see has in the model. So one important thing that I think it's important to realize in the model was that he proposed a different collective housing, but also in the same neighborhood, housing for the middle classes and housing for the local mosaic population. So in this case, for instance, Simões Carvalho proposed to the government that the population of indigenous or economically weak, as Anna said, was two-third parts of the population. It wasn't possible and stays in one-third part of the population. But the proposal was launched to join and start to a multi-racial neighborhood involving the different parts of the community. So I'm not going in the details of the drawings of the typology, but you can see also the typology. It's also always a semi-duplex, and it's coming bigger as well. The families came also bigger. So have an idea, the collective spaces that are around these buildings are also different. So if the buildings are lower, and for the bigger families, the collective spaces are smaller, and where the children can play, for instance. In the opposite, in the smaller apartments are located along the commercial street. So, and now we, of course, why we are doing this? To understand and to knowing the architecture, but also now to know how the people live inside there today. And also regarding the collective spaces. So are these two interests in specify or identify the constructive techniques that was applied and how the people live in these situations today. So, and I have to highlight the process of the company Precol. Precol was the responsible for all the process, constructive and for selling, advertising of the neighborhood of Precol. And it's quite interesting also how the way to sell the houses were changed, and they showing already the typology was very modern or different for them. In different spaces, so I'll just show the first unit neighborhood and the last one. The last one was is also by Simões Carvalho in Lobo de Carvalho. It was planned from the 1968, so you are almost approaching the revolution. And the difference, or for me the big difference in this plan, is the architects already count with the pre-existence that you can see in a little red. They are announced. So they are not doing a tabula rasa of they were founding, and at the same time always put different kinds of population there. Unfortunately, only one building was built, and we can realize how the technique and the constructive elements are important to define the form of the architectural scope. So the typologies are always very simple in a kind of way, but I think the most important is the idea of being modern, of living in this kind of complex. But as you can realize, they are going for middle up white class. So, but at the same time, why we are doing this? Again, to understand how the people live there. Okay, so this is the previous project that allow us to make some surveys and oral histories, and once again to understand what is behind. So I have to go faster. Anna already explained. I'm going out of my field of this presentation but I can resist of showing you the same principles were applied in a project for a local population. So, and before starting the project, Simões Carvalho did a very profound survey regarding the fishermen populations in the island of Luanda. So this starts for understand the roads and the way they are a group, but also the parties, how the ceremonies in the different situations, or even the situations for West. I want just to highlight the difference between, they are very small, between the housings that you can see in the drawing on the left for the black fishermen and the houses on the right for the white fishermen. So we have at the same time the both populations living in the neighborhood. So how the technical construction are and what they finally present by the plan, the modern urban plan design with the dwellings with the same basic and modern principles, but in this they have the typology around the patio, the exterior patio that is following the vernacular typology of the fishermen's population. So we only know that we'll build the model houses, unfortunately, but they were built by the population that have collaborated. So thank you.
So we are just, so thank you very much for attending our research group and for attending our presentations. I would like to know if anyone would like to make a comment, questions. Okay, perfect. We are, sí. So just ask. Okay, we'll try to answer.
Hi, my name is Tolu Onabolu. I'm a lecturer in Newcastle. So thank you very much for your presentations. I think I don't have a question, I have more of a remark, and it's probably more useful for the people finishing their PhDs. But I think more generally, it's in a couple of parts. I was taking a lot of notes, and it just became too much at a point. So I think the first part is on the notion of decolonization. And I think that what I'm seeing is that decolonization in what I've seen in the last day or two is a sort of opening up as opposed to here's what we think or here's what we know about decolonization. It's more like, here is how we are approaching this thing. And in the sort of spirit of opening up, I would like to share something, with you regarding some of the ways you're looking at housing. So within the sort of Western academia, we tend to look at housing as mass housing strategies, what the architects did master planning-wise, etc. Now, I'm from Lagos, and I didn't leave Lagos until I was 27, so I have a pretty robust understanding of how housing or how the systems work. And I was also going to say, I come from a middle-class family, but the way you use middle class is not recognizable to me. So your use of the term middle class is almost working class, the sort of working class population. And that would make me come from an elite background, but it's not an elite background. Now, so that's the first part. The second part is that now when you look at these populations outside of what you're terming middle class, you find out that their histories go back a lot further than the colonial project, right? So a lot of these people, like how did Luanda get colonized? How did Lagos get colonized? How did Accra get colonized? So you have agents at play since at least the 16 and 1700s. And a lot of these people are robustly westernized. So they have university educations. By the 1700s, you have local Lagosians, local Accras, having education in places like London and Brazil. So by the time you're seeing these things, the way the elite Lagosians or the elite Accra live, or the elite Senegalese live, is very different from what you're presenting. And their housing types are also very different. So the system is also quite feudal. So what you're seeing in some of the townships you're looking at are, you make a reference to the Europeans would employ men, but the local elite will employ girls. And there's a whole logic behind it, because there's polygamy at play, but there's also, what, for lack of a better word, local slavery at play. Right? And all of this, there's a sort of constant transformation between the cities and the towns, or the cities and the villages. So all of the people that the housing projects are looking at are more of a peasant population who have very little connection or understanding of any sort of Europeanized living. Meanwhile, all of the elites have 300, 400 years of coevolution with the European system. So if you think that, you know, the urban environments of the 1700s in Europe, when you read the archives or when you read the reports, it's not that different from the way the local elites lived, because they're in constant exchange with themselves, and the populations are pretty small. So I think the remark is, it would be useful to check on all these other forms of living, which are not just about the townships or the companies, because what the companies were doing was employing en masse a sort of peasant class and trying to re-assimilate and trying to, if you like, bring them into this kind of European living. I'll stop there.
More questions, since there are a lot of people. Fortunately for us, thank you very much for your comment. But maybe we could collect. So maybe you do have the microphone, and you do a lot of, and then we try to answer 2 or 3 questions in a row.
So thanks for a fascinating session. Great papers. I have a few questions and comments. I mean, first of all, for Anna. I mean, this is a fascinating period, and the Portuguese case during this time period really has specificities that I think are important for current debates on urbanity and urban planning and architecture in Africa. I do have a few questions. I had a question about this chronology that you present, or periodization across the 3 colonies, because of course the realm of, you know, Portuguese professional discourse is networked, but it becomes articulated with situated assemblages and with the very distinct histories of these 3 territories, you know, Guinea, Angola, and Mozambique. And even within the countries, you know, they're very different regions. You know, the colonial history of the Zambezi Valley is completely different from the south of Mozambique, for example. And that has implications for urban planning history. So this is a question that I had, you know, is it possible to do this broad narrative that, or to what extent is it possible to have this broad narrative that actually flattens some of these very rich, more situated histories? I also had another question for Anna, which is about the legal distinction that Portuguese occupation made between assimilated subjects and native subject that was formally ended in 1961, more or less, but continued, you know, having effects afterwards. And at least in Lourenço Marques, you know, present-day Maputo, the so-called indigenous neighborhoods was actually aimed at assimilated subjects and not the formally indigenous subjects. So I wonder if that was also the case in Angola. For Francesca, I mean, I'm fascinating presentation. It got an award, as some of us know, at recent IST conference in Singapore. So I do have a few questions. I mean, what is the frame of reference when you're talking about the norm and exception in urbanity? Because, for example, when you present the map of Bissau and you say, oh, here are the end-plan neighborhoods, and I look at that map and I think, no, that's the city. What's the exception, especially in a country like Guinea-Bissau, where there are very few Portuguese settlers? What's the exception is Central Bissau. That's the area of space in that city and that country that evades the norm. So, I think it's important to think about those frames of references and how we talk about cities like Bissau and their history. I also think it would be, there's some important theoretical questions that you addressed. I think the issue of the relation between colonialism and modernity is one that probably would be great to develop further. And I think the previous very useful comment also addressed that issue. And probably Olufemi Taiwo's work is a Nigerian philosopher, would be useful to think through that distinction between colonialism and modernity. This is also something that I think is important for Beatriz's paper. I mean, is it about, because what are we seeing in present day Ajuda? Is it Ghanaian tradition, being recovered, or is it about just the lived modernity in the present day? And finally, for a series of papers, there's this concept of European that keeps appearing in colonial discourses, and I think we need to situate this discourse, because and I've published a piece a few years ago in Architectural Histories on this issue, which is, I mean, the concept of Europeanness is also produced through this process of colonial occupation. So we need, and as the previous colleague was mentioning, when you listen to accounts of late colonial Lourenço Marques, in actual reality, there were stray dogs, there was garbage, sidewalks in many neighborhoods were not built. So, I mean, this discursive distinction between European and Mozambican or Angolan or whatever term was used at the time, it was something that was being constructed by the settlers. And finally, just a very brief comment for Inês. I was fascinated because when you were talking about the propaganda poster by Henrique Galvão in the 1930s, you actually didn't show that poster. You showed an artwork that was designed 10 years ago by Paulo Moreira, our colleague. So, no, but I think that's I think that was very interesting. So, well, congratulations, everyone.
I think now it's my turn. Do you want to answer, or should I keep on with the questions?
Well, I can start, but thanks for the comments and the remarks, Tiago, and the suggestions of lectures and readings. I don't know if I understood the first question. So the frame of reference when I talk about the urban area of Bissau, it was that? Okay. Well, in the thesis, I try to be like maybe more specific than today. That according to the colonial, let's say, envision of the city of Bissau, we had a consolidated center, and everything that was outside this consolidated and infrastructure center were appointed as suburbs. And for example, Ajuda, the neighborhood that I studied, was located at the margins, so outside its suburb. Of course, the colonial city was this wall environment that comprise consolidated cities, suburbs, and outside this environment. I don't know if I answered, or yeah, we can talk later. And about the local elites and all what Toulouse brought to discussion. For example, for the case of Bissau and Guinea-Bissau, it's very, very specific because we had a lot of actors and a lot of, yeah, I would like to use the word actors and not categories, but there was this very strong bond with Cape Verde, sorry. Cape Verde, so there were the Portuguese, let's say, elite, and there were the Cape Verdeans society, which was neither, which was an elite for the, let's say, the Africans living, for example, that weren't allowed to live inside the city or didn't have the possibilities to live inside the city. And then there was the elite of this African society, and then there were, so the certification for Bissau society, it's really, maybe it's complex. And house was used as a tool to create this certification, and even it was used by Africans themselves to achieve a social status, to be part of the elite discourse, even without being maybe part of them. And I can give you later.
Following the colonial archive, that I know that we have to decolonize the archive. I completely agree with you, but in a way, what I tried to present here was the position in terms of how the colonial government and how mainly the national government saw the problem. And for the national government, the specificities of each territory they were aware of them, but in the national discourse, that kind of specificities were not, in a way, enunciated. So what we are trying to do here is to trying to understand how these African population who were newcomers to the cities, how they were accommodated in terms of housing, and the solutions that they had on the field, and how the technicians saw the problem, how the social scientists introduced the problem as a political one, and it's very interesting that only when the politicians tried to address the problem that the social science arrived. Before there was no, it was only the technicians trying to solve it in a very pragmatic and in a way realistic in their terms, how to solve it, because before the Second World War, the African populations' housing, the housing for these populations were seen as a sanitary problem. And this is, of course, because it's of the segregated city and how the city was produced and how it was these modern ideas of having sectors and zoning and answering to the zoning and so on. And so it was a sanitary problem. And only after the Second World War, the Portuguese government has to face these communities and this population in a different approach and became a political one. And then the social scientists came, tried to introduce some rules, some guidelines, in order to the architects and the engineers and the planners to follow. And so they introduced all these categories. They said, just put these populations first in the peripheries, and they came to these more urban neighborhoods, and then they will become full citizens. This was the process, how they saw it, the process. And even if the situation in Angola or in Mozambique are different, how these social scientists saw it, it was like this. It was they generalized the problem. They tried to introduce a kind of a protocol. Let's do it like this. And then we will have a perfect society, a mixed society. And then this was more or less contemporary, these debates were contemporary to the war. And of course, the war, it also raises new questions. So if you have huge neighborhoods of African people, that will become a problem, because these people can rebel against the other society. And also Amadeu Soares Castilho said, well, we have a problem here, we have peaceful cities, and with a lot of these newcomers, you will stop to have these peaceful cities if you don't control the problem, if you don't make decisions. So once more, they was trying to generalize. And then it's true, and that it's part of, it's lacking in our work, and I assume that, it's true that the local governments try in a way to give more regional or more local or more specified solutions. They try to deal. And then they address the national government. They say, well, we need this amount of money to face the problem. And they said, oh, no way, you have to solve it in a different way. So the problem come again to the national government and say, well, how to resolve it? Well, we will introduce self-construction, and then people can build their own houses, and then even because the African aesthetic is so beautiful, and the houses are adapted to the climate, so they recognize it's a lot of aesthetical and technical. They valorize this in order to solve the problem, because they could not provide what they thought was a Western house to all this population, because this was the intention since the beginning. The intention of the beginning was not allowed people to build how they wanted. In a way, it was to introduce order. It was to introduce order, but then in a pragmatic way that it was impossible. So, okay, let's talk with this. Let's try to make surveys, how people build their houses, to introduce it in our design. For instance, like Simões de Carvalho tried. It was a failure, of course, because the design was too much sophisticated, so only one model house was built. Or like Francisco Rodrigues did in Lubito, let's try to teach people how to build in a Western way in order to reproduce Western houses. And then one more, if you do a zoom to these houses in Alto do Liro, as Johan said that we should do it in research, we'll see that the houses are all different, but the layout is still more or less similar, because people build it how they could. And then we see in Ajuda neighborhood, the authorities saying, well, we cannot apply these people to build how we want it, because they have no economic means to do it. So what I think it's possible. I think it's possible, and we are far away from being able to do it. I think it's possible to generalize, to make a kind of a frame to understand how the colonial government establish protocols, and then these case studies that, for instance, Francesca showed and others, can, in a way, explain how this protocol was subverted by the communities, by the people, the people who built these neighborhoods themselves, because they built themselves. They built their own houses. We know that. Most of these houses were built by their own inhabitants. And how they changed the protocol. So, and we were trying to, just to do like this, so trying to understand the top, and then the girls will frame the bottom, and then maybe in the end we'll be able to understand a little more the process, because this was a very complex process. I think, and you know it better than me, because we are also involved in that. Sorry. I will not talk no more.
No, just to add a small answer for the first question, I should specify it better. When I say the European middle class, it was because the buildings in these neighborhoods that I showed were for the workers of the state, the funcionários do Estado, for the whale companies or for the mail companies. So they are sought and designed for them. But I have here my Angolan colleagues, and I remember from the PhD of Maria Alice Correia that the Angolan population during the Colonial War, in other words, before the revolution or the liberation, the Angolan population can apply and go for the blocks of collective housing. So it was just that I realized that I should specify it better, because it was just only in this point of view. They were designed for the workers of Portugal, the state of Portugal. Of course, all of that was changing during the time. I don't know if I can specify it better. I know there are two more questions, and after we close.
Okay. Well, my name is also Mott. I'm from the Technical University of Delft. And so I have a question, considering the common thread of housing in the four presentations, which, by the way, were very inspiring. So congratulations on this amazing work. Nevertheless, the thoroughness of the presentations, there is one thing that it was almost, let's say, invisible in all of the four, except actually the last one, which is the issue of ownership. Because, for example, well, probably that's because it won a award, but I really loved Francesca's presentation, especially also bringing forth ethnographic methods to try and survey how the houses transform through time. And this is something that I've been, I think it's a little bit absent in the conference, which is sometimes we show how it looked like, or sometimes we show how it looks today. Well, it looked like in the colonial past, how it looks like today. But we fail to address the different temporalities of what brings us from that moment till today. And Francesca, I think you did it brilliantly by showing how how the bungalow, the basic bungalow, evolved through time by this indeed insertion of subjectivities that in the end of the day created a very lively and thriving community. Now, my question is, how was that possible? What was the ownership model? Did they own? Did they rent it? Because, you don't extend your house if you don't know if you are going to, keep it for you, right? And to a certain extent, I believe that Inês also talked about this idea of the neutralizing past. I think this is also a beautiful thing of showing that even though you may start with this basic core house, eventually it can be appropriated, reappropriated, and to a certain extent have an afterlife of encroachment, I think, as Inês showed. So maybe for the four of you, but especially for Francesca, could you clarify which was the ownership model of the cases in the Ajuda neighborhood? Thank you.
Okay. I was looking for the English word, but I don't know if I know it. But the houses, when they were built during the colonial rule, they were with renda resoluvel. So people rent out the houses, and after 10 years, they would have, 10 or 15 years, they would have owned like the full property. And it's interesting because the war came, not the war, the independence came, but this process kept on. So even with the new, let's say, country, with the independent country, they were able to keep on paying for the house, and most all of the dwellers in Ajuda, the families in Ajuda, own their full property. So, yeah, maybe. Sovereign neutrality. No.
One more question, and we have to close.
But we can continue.
We have to close.
No, they were saying that.
We have to close, but do your question and we will answer by the way. Very well. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
It's very, very important. My question is a little question. Of CTT or the people who go to and go and live in CTT, it pass family for family, or you can buy it for yourself. This is the main question. You know, what is nowadays, if someone wants to have that kind of apartment, it's possible, it's not possible, it's far away from can happen. It's only my question. Thank you. That it works. We already realize that the flats pass from generation to generation. So the citizens in our days, they have a sense of belonging for the neighborhood, not so like Bairro da Ajuda, because the scale it's bigger, but they belong to there. So their fathers live there, the cousins and so on, and they want to keep to live there. So they don't want to go to another neighborhood. And I think that is one of the wins of this experience.